The world now carries unprecedented debt levels across governments, corporations, households and banks. This burden quietly shapes every interest rate decision, every budget debate worldwide today. Unlike past crises, this imbalance spans all major economies simultaneously without exception anywhere. Governments borrowed heavily after global shocks, turning emergency tools into permanent policies everywhere. Central banks created money to stabilize markets, but also inflated debt dependence massively. Private corporations followed the same path, leveraging cheap credit to boost valuations artificially. Consumers too relied on credit to afford housing, healthcare, education, and basic living. This synchronized borrowing pushed total global debt above $300 trillion estimated. Such a number exceeds global economic output many times, making repayment mathematically impossible. Debt is no longer a bridge between cycles, but the road itself forward. Every year, new borrowing pays old obligations, preventing default, but compounding risk steadily. Low interest rates once made this cycle feel safe, but that era ended. When inflation returned, central banks were forced to raise rates, exposing fragility everywhere. Higher rates increase interest payments for governments consuming budgets meant for public services. Billions shift from healthcare and infrastructure into debt servicing every single fiscal year. This creates political pressure because voters feel poorer while governments appear increasingly constrained. Cutting spending sparks unrest, raising taxes damages growth, and printing money fuels inflation. No policy choice remains painless when debt reaches this scale globally today already. Countries therefore choose the least visible option, allowing inflation to erode obligations quietly. Inflation reduces the real value of past debt by weakening purchasing power steadily. Savers lose wealth while debtors benefit, creating redistribution without legislation or public consent. This hidden tax destabilizes societies as living costs rise faster than wages long term. Trust in money declines, leading people to seek alternative stores of value increasingly. Gold, property, foreign currencies, and even digital assets become refugees from erosion fears. Capital flight weakens domestic investment, slowing productivity growth and worsening debt dynamics further. Governments then borrow more to stimulate economies, repeating the same destructive cycle again. This is why debt becomes addictive, requiring ever larger doses to maintain stability. Japan experienced this first after its 1990 asset bubble collapse, creating stagnation. Europe followed during sovereign debt crises, while the United States expanded deficits continuously. China now faces similar pressure through local government borrowing and property sector leverage. Different systems converge toward the same outcome: debt replaces organic growth everywhere gradually. Financial markets depend on government bonds as safe assets, supporting leverage structures widely. If sovereign debt loses credibility, banks, pension funds, and insurers face massive instability. Therefore, leaders avoid default at all costs, even when repayment becomes unrealistic forever. Instead, they extend maturities, refinance obligations, and hope future growth rescues balance sheets. Unfortunately, aging populations, shrinking workforces, and lower productivity make such growth unlikely across. Fewer workers support more retirees, straining tax bases and increasing welfare spending obligations. Debt rises even without new crises, simply to maintain existing social commitments sustainably. Political leaders postpone reforms because short-term pain risks elections even when necessary. Thus, structural problems accumulate quietly while borrowing covers gaps year after year continuously. Markets tolerate this until confidence shifts, causing sudden spikes in borrowing costs dangerously. Such moments trigger emergency interventions by central banks printing money to restore stability. That rescue, however, adds more debt, reinforcing the long-term vulnerability of the system. Over time, each intervention grows larger, because underlying imbalances were never corrected previously. The global economy therefore resembles a heavily leveraged structure sensitive to even small shocks. Geopolitical conflict, pandemics, energy disruptions, or financial accidents all threaten cascading failures quickly. Policymakers know this, which is why they hesitate to allow recessions to cleanse debt. Instead, they prop markets up, creating moral hazard, where risk is rewarded repeatedly. Investors expect bailouts, encouraging speculative behavior that inflates bubbles across asset classes globally. When those bubbles burst, public balance sheets absorb losses, turning private risk into sovereign. This transfer increases government debt even faster, making future rescues more expensive still. Ultimately, taxpayers and currency holders bear the burden through inflation and reduced services. The social contract weakens when people feel exploited by financial systems designed for elites. Political polarization rises as economic anxiety fuels populist movements challenging established institutions everywhere. These tensions make cooperative solutions harder, even though the debt problem is global. No country wants to tighten policies alone because capital would flee to looser jurisdictions. So all continue borrowing, hoping inflation or growth eventually reduces their relative debt. However, when everyone inflates simultaneously, currencies weaken together, leaving real burdens unchanged for societies. The illusion of relief hides a deeper erosion of purchasing power and long-term stability. This slow decay explains why debt crises rarely explode immediately but grind economies down. Productivity, investment, innovation, and risk-taking decline when future returns appear uncertain for businesses. Without growth, debt becomes heavier, making each year harder to stabilize finances sustainably. This vicious circle is why economists warn of secular stagnation driven by excessive leverage. Escaping would require either massive debt write-downs or extraordinary growth, neither politically acceptable. Write-downs hurt creditors, including banks, pensions, and households, triggering financial chaos immediately. Extraordinary growth requires reforms, investments, and demographics that cannot be engineered quickly anywhere. So leaders choose the path of delay, using monetary tools to extend the status quo. This buys time, but increases eventual costs, making future adjustments more painful when unavoidable. Every year of postponement adds interest, compounding the size of the reckoning ahead. Financial stability today therefore comes at the expense of tomorrow, creating intergenerational inequality across societies. Young workers inherit obligations created by past borrowing, limiting their opportunities and growth prospects. This generational imbalance fuels discontent and skepticism toward political and economic leadership worldwide. Without trust in institutions, even moderate crises can escalate rapidly into systemic breakdowns. That is why the global debt disaster remains the greatest hidden risk facing humanity. It operates quietly behind stable markets while accumulating pressures that eventually force change abruptly. Understanding this system explains why simple solutions fail, because incentives reward continuation, not correction. As long as debt sustains growth, policymakers will avoid confronting structural flaws openly. Only when the costs overwhelm the benefits will reform become unavoidable despite resistance everywhere. That moment approaches as debt servicing consumes ever larger shares of national income streams. And until then, the world remains trapped inside a system it cannot afford to maintain. The crisis deepens because financial institutions rely on government debt as their primary collateral everywhere. Banks use sovereign bonds to secure loans, creating massive webs of interconnected leverage across markets. When bond values fall, collateral weakens, forcing institutions to sell assets to maintain capital requirements. This selling pushes prices lower, creating feedback loops that destabilize entire financial systems rapidly. Central banks intervene by purchasing bonds, preventing collapse, but increasing public debt simultaneously worldwide. This dynamic transforms central banks from monetary regulators into balance sheet stabilizers for governments. Their independence erodes as political leaders depend on cheap financing to fund budgets and promises. Markets recognize this dependence, leading investors to assume central banks will always intervene eventually. That assumption removes discipline, encouraging governments to borrow even more without fear of consequences. Credit rating agencies hesitate to downgrade major economies because doing so could trigger global turmoil. Thus, even weak fiscal positions appear safe as long as markets remain artificially supported by liquidity. This illusion persists until inflation forces policymakers to tighten monetary conditions against their preferences. Rising rates reveal vulnerabilities as debt servicing costs explode across heavily indebted sovereign balance sheets. Japan experiences this slowly. Europe feels it periodically, and emerging markets suffer it violently. Developing nations face higher risk because foreign-denominated debt becomes more expensive when currencies weaken. Capital flows reverse, pushing borrowing costs upward, creating debt crises similar to those historically observed. These crises force painful austerity which reduces growth, worsening the debt burden further. Danger. International institutions provide bailouts, but those funds are loans adding to long-term obligations. This is how debt traps operate, locking nations into cycles of dependency and stagnation globally. Rich nations avoid this through monetary sovereignty, allowing them to print their own currency. However, printing money dilutes value, transferring wealth from savers to debtors over time. This invisible redistribution creates political backlash when living standards fall despite nominal growth reported. Households struggle with higher food, housing, and energy prices, eroding confidence in economic management. Governments face pressure to subsidize essentials, further increasing fiscal deficits and borrowing requirements. The system feeds itself, each intervention requiring another larger intervention to sustain stability. Eventually, markets test limits, demanding higher yields to compensate for inflation and risk exposure. When that happens, central banks must choose between currency stability and financial system survival. Protecting banks means printing money, risking inflation while defending currency risks market collapse. This impossible choice defines the modern debt era across all major economies. Policymakers delay decisions, hoping growth or innovation changes the equation in their favor. However, structural headwinds such as aging demographics reduce labor, force participation, and productivity growth. Technology improves efficiency but does not create enough high-wage employment to offset trends. Globalization once provided growth, but political backlash and supply chain disruptions reversed integration processes. This reduces trade efficiency, increasing costs and lowering growth potential worldwide simultaneously. Lower growth means less revenue, making debt harder to manage across public budgets everywhere. Thus, even without new crises, the debt problem worsens simply through demographic and structural shifts. Markets remain calm because central banks maintain liquidity, masking underlying fragility across asset classes. Stock markets reach highs not due to productivity, but because excess money seeks returns. Real estate inflates, similarly pricing younger generations out of ownership, creating social resentment. Wealth inequality grows as asset holders benefit while wage earners struggle under inflationary pressures. This inequality feeds political polarization, making consensus on reform even harder to achieve. Populist leaders promise relief through spending, or protectionism, increasing fiscal strain further. Long-term planning gives way to short-term political survival, perpetuating irresponsible borrowing habits. The debt disaster therefore becomes not just economic, but deeply institutional and cultural. No leader wants to be the one who cuts benefits or raises taxes. Therefore, every administration inherits worse numbers than the previous one faced before. This pattern continues until external shocks force abrupt adjustments rather than planned transitions. History shows that such moments often coincide with wars, currency crises, or financial panics. Those events reset systems, but at enormous human and economic cost. The modern world hopes to avoid such disruptions, but structural pressures make them increasingly likely. Without reform, debt continues rising until markets no longer believe repayment is possible. At that point, confidence collapses, triggering currency devaluation, inflation, and capital flight rapidly. Central banks respond by printing more, accelerating the loss of trust further. This spiral leads to stagflation, where prices rise while growth remains weak painfully. Stagflation erodes purchasing power and destroys savings, causing widespread social distress. Governments then impose controls, taxes, and restrictions which often worsen economic outcomes historically. The cycle of intervention and unintended consequences deepens, creating instability rather than stability. Meanwhile, global cooperation weakens as nations prioritize domestic survival over coordinated solutions. Currency wars emerge as countries attempt to devalue to gain trade advantages. These competitive devaluations cancel each other, leaving everyone poorer and more indebted. Debt remains the central unresolved issue tying together all these symptoms. It underlies inflation, financial bubbles, political unrest, and declining living standards worldwide. Yet it remains politically untouchable because confronting it requires admitting uncomfortable truths publicly. That truth is that many promises cannot be funded without permanent money creation. And permanent money creation eventually destroys the value of money itself. This is the silent danger behind the global debt disaster unfolding in slow motion. It does not explode overnight, but grinds economies down through decades of misallocation. Understanding this helps explain why recovery feels weaker after every crisis despite massive stimulus. Debt absorbs growth before it reaches ordinary people, leaving them frustrated and insecure. As obligations increase, flexibility decreases, locking governments into rigid fiscal paths forever. That rigidity makes adaptation to new challenges much harder than in healthier systems. Thus, the world remains trapped between the need for stability and the cost of stagnation. And the longer this continues, the greater the eventual adjustment will have to be. The future of the global debt system depends on how long confidence remains intact worldwide. Confidence allows borrowing to continue even when numbers suggest insolvency under any realistic conditions. As long as investors believe governments will be supported, they continue buying bonds without hesitation. That belief rests entirely on central banks maintaining liquidity through intervention whenever markets destabilize. However, intervention itself fuels inflation, weakening the purchasing power that underpins financial trust. This creates a paradox where stabilizing debt erodes the currency used to denominate that debt. Over time, investors demand higher yields to compensate for inflation risk and declining real returns. Higher yields increase debt servicing costs, accelerating fiscal deterioration across national balance sheets rapidly. Governments then face rising deficits, even if spending remains unchanged because interest consumes more revenue. This leads to further borrowing just to cover interest payments, creating a classic debt spiral. Such spirals historically end either through inflationary erosion or restructuring of obligations forcibly. Inflationary erosion is politically easier because it spreads losses across society gradually and invisibly. Restructuring is traumatic because it imposes direct losses on creditors, including banks, pensions, and households. Therefore, leaders prefer inflation, even though it undermines living standards and long-term economic stability. This slow destruction of purchasing power explains why wages feel stagnant despite reported economic growth. Nominal incomes rise, but real incomes fall as prices increase faster than compensation for labor. This discrepancy fuels public anger and distrust toward institutions claiming economic success. When people no longer believe official statistics, political legitimacy begins to weaken dangerously. That legitimacy crisis can destabilize democracies and authoritarian regimes alike under sufficient economic stress. History shows that prolonged stagnation and inflation often lead to radical political transformations. Those transformations may reset economic systems, but often at the cost of social upheaval. Therefore, the debt disaster is not merely financial, but deeply intertwined with political stability. Nations with strong institutions may manage gradual adjustment, while weaker ones face abrupt collapse. Emerging markets often suffer first because capital flees when confidence wavers across global markets. Developed nations delay consequences through monetary expansion, but eventually face similar pressures. No country is immune because all depend on the same interconnected financial architecture. This architecture was built on assumptions of perpetual growth that no longer hold. Slower population growth, declining productivity, and environmental limits constrain future economic expansion. Without expansion, debt cannot be sustainably serviced regardless of monetary policy interventions. This reality forces difficult choices that politicians have postponed for decades. One option is fiscal consolidation involving spending cuts and tax increases to stabilize debt. Such measures slow growth and provoke backlash, making them politically risky in democratic systems. Another option is financial repression, where governments cap interest rates below inflation to reduce debt. This punishes savers but benefits borrowers, effectively transferring wealth to the state gradually. Financial repression often leads to capital controls limiting where citizens can move their money. These controls protect domestic financing but reduce freedom and market efficiency significantly. Historically, many countries have used such methods after major wars or debt crises. They work temporarily but distort economies and suppress innovation and investment over time. The final option is debt restructuring, which openly acknowledges that obligations cannot be met. This triggers losses for creditors but can restore balance and enable future growth. However, in a globalized financial system, such restructurings risk contagion across borders. Therefore, international coordination would be required, which is difficult amid geopolitical rivalry. As cooperation declines, the likelihood of coordinated solutions diminishes significantly. Instead, countries pursue national strategies that often conflict with each other economically. Currency devaluations, trade barriers, and industrial policies become tools of competition. These policies reduce efficiency and increase costs, reinforcing stagnation and debt burdens further. Thus, the global economy becomes fragmented, undermining the growth needed to resolve debt. This self-reinforcing loop keeps the system trapped in a low-growth, high-debt equilibrium. Breaking that equilibrium would require extraordinary productivity gains or unprecedented political courage. Productivity gains are possible through technological breakthroughs, but adoption takes time and investment. Political courage is rare because costs are immediate while benefits accrue slowly. Therefore, inertia dominates, allowing problems to worsen until crisis forces change. That crisis could emerge through financial markets if bond investors lose confidence suddenly. It could also emerge through inflation if price stability collapses beyond central bank control. Either scenario would force rapid adjustments with severe economic and social consequences. Preparing for such outcomes requires understanding the mechanisms driving the debt disaster. Citizens and investors alike must recognize that stability today is not guaranteed tomorrow. Diversification of assets and geographic exposure becomes important when currencies face erosion. At the same time, political engagement matters because policy choices influence debt trajectories. Long-term sustainability requires aligning promises with resources rather than relying on perpetual borrowing. That alignment means difficult conversations about pensions, healthcare, taxation, and government responsibilities. Avoiding those conversations simply pushes the burden onto future generations unfairly. As awareness grows, pressure may build for reform before crisis strikes. Whether that happens remains uncertain, given current political and economic incentives. What is clear is that the debt disaster will define the coming decades globally. It shapes interest rates, inflation, housing markets, and the distribution of wealth. Ignoring it does not make it disappear, but allows it to compound silently. Understanding its dynamics is the first step toward managing its eventual consequences. While solutions are complex, transparency and honesty about the scale of the problem are essential. Only with informed publics can democratic societies choose paths that balance stability and fairness. Otherwise, decisions will be made in crisis, when options are fewer and costs higher. The global debt disaster is therefore not only an economic challenge, but a test of governance. How societies respond will determine whether the future is marked by renewal or prolonged stagnation. That choice remains open, but the window for gentle adjustment is slowly closing. The final question surrounding global debt is not whether it exists, but how societies respond. Responses determine whether adjustment happens gradually through policy or violently through economic breakdown. Gradual adjustment requires political consensus that prioritizes long-term stability over short-term comfort. Such consensus is difficult when electorates face immediate pressures from inflation, housing, and employment. Therefore, many governments choose policies that soothe voters today while worsening debt tomorrow. This behavior perpetuates the imbalance, keeping economies dependent on borrowing to maintain living standards. As debts grow larger, interest payments crowd out productive investment, reducing future growth potential further. Lower growth makes debt harder to service, creating a reinforcing cycle of stagnation and leverage. Breaking this cycle requires shifting resources towards productivity, innovation, and workforce development strategically. However, high debt limits fiscal space, making such investments politically and financially challenging. Private investment also suffers when uncertainty rises and expected returns decline amid unstable macroeconomic conditions. Businesses delay expansion, households reduce spending, and economies slow, reinforcing the debt problem. This is why debt crises often coincide with periods of weak growth and low confidence. Restoring confidence requires credible plans for sustainability, not just temporary stimulus or emergency support. Those plans must address structural drivers like demographics, healthcare, costs, and pension obligations realistically. Ignoring these drivers merely postpones inevitable adjustments while increasing their eventual severity. Financial markets eventually test credibility by demanding higher yields or withdrawing capital from risky jurisdictions. When that happens, governments face hard choices between austerity, inflation, or default. Each option carries costs, but delaying choice only increases the magnitude of those costs. Therefore, transparency and early action provide the best chance for minimizing long-term damage. International cooperation can help by sharing burdens and stabilizing markets during transitions. Yet geopolitical tensions often undermine such cooperation, reducing effectiveness of collective responses. In a fragmented world, debt problems become harder to solve because spillovers intensify volatility. Capital flows react quickly, transmitting stress from one region to another through financial channels. This interconnectedness means no country can isolate itself from global debt dynamics. Even nations with strong balance sheets feel pressure when global markets become unstable. Thus, reform must be both domestic and international to address systemic vulnerabilities effectively. At the domestic level, governments need credible fiscal frameworks that constrain excessive borrowing over time. Such frameworks include spending rules, independent oversight, and long-term budget projections tied to demographics. They also require political commitment to respect these rules even during favorable economic conditions. Historically, governments relax discipline during booms, leading to larger imbalances when downturns arrive. Avoiding this pattern is essential to preventing future debt disasters. At the international level, institutions must adapt to provide orderly restructuring mechanisms when debts become unsustainable. This reduces chaos and protects global financial stability during necessary adjustments. Without such mechanisms, defaults become disorderly, harming creditors and debtors alike unnecessarily. Reforming these systems is complex but necessary in a world of unprecedented leverage. Public understanding also plays a role because informed citizens can support responsible fiscal policies. Education about debt and its consequences reduces susceptibility to unrealistic political promises. When voters demand sustainability, leaders have incentives to pursue prudent strategies. This cultural shift is slow but vital for long-term economic health. Technology may also assist by improving productivity and enabling better tax collection and spending efficiency. However, technology alone cannot solve debt without accompanying institutional reforms. Ultimately, the global debt disaster reflects choices about consumption, saving, and investment across generations. Balancing these choices requires accepting limits and prioritizing future well-being over immediate gratification. Such acceptance is difficult but necessary to restore stability and trust. As the world moves forward, pressures will increase, forcing societies to confront these realities. Those that prepare early will manage transitions more smoothly than those that deny the problem. The coming years will reveal whether cooperation or conflict defines the path to adjustment. Either way, debt will remain central to economic debates and political outcomes worldwide. Understanding its mechanics empowers individuals to make better decisions about savings, investments, and risk. It also highlights the importance of accountable governance in managing public resources responsibly. If this analysis helped clarify the forces shaping global debt, consider supporting the channel by subscribing. Sharing the video helps others understand these issues and strengthens informed discussion around economic stability.